So today I'll be presenting two experiments that I did in my PhD. Like Kat said, my research looks at how rising income inequality shapes stereotypes of social classes, so how people perceive the wealthiest and poorest in their society. So just a little bit of a background information about my topic. Recently, income inequality has been rising in many countries around the world. According to the most recent Oxfam report, the world top 1% now owns twice as much wealth as the remaining 6.9 billion people combined. And researchers started to show that this extreme level of inequality is associated with more societal problems. For example, in more unequal societies, there's increased crime rate, political unrest, and status anxiety. But also, people have reduced social cohesion, trust, and community involvement. And so income inequality is a social problem, and it is a problem that has been discussed a lot in the media, whether it is the media in Thailand, the media in China, in the UK, or in the US. And when people talk about income inequality, they also talk about social class. So as you can see here, across all these news headlines about income inequality, the rich and the poor are also mentioned. And when people talk about the rich and the poor, they seem to attribute some sorts of characteristics or apply stereotypes about what it means to be rich or poor. So for example, on the first news headline here, people attribute being rich or being a billionaire as being hated by everyone else in society. Whereas in the last news headline here, people attribute being poor to laziness or some sorts of inner characteristics. And research also support these observations. So there's a recent line of research showing that when income inequality is higher, people pay more attention to social class. So a recent paper in manuscript preparation by Kim Peters and colleagues found that when participants were exposed to situations of higher income inequality, they're more likely to talk about the rich and the poor, but also want to know more wealth-related information about other people. So this evidence suggests that when income inequality is higher, people think that wealthy and poor are meaningful social groups in society. Another line of research suggests that when income inequality is higher, social class stereotypes are also stronger, where people perceive the rich as more competent, capable, ambitious, while they perceive the poor as lazier and more incompetent. And just to elaborate on the second point about social class stereotypes a little bit more, research on stereotype content dimensions shows that groups are stereotyped based on two broad dimensions on their ability to achieve goals and build relationship with others. So groups that are able to achieve goals and gain a higher status are perceived as more assertive and competent than other groups, while groups that are perceived as able to build and maintain relationship with others are perceived as more moral and friendly. And these stereotype dimensions also apply to social class stereotypes. So in particular, perceived competence distinguish stereotypes of the rich and the poor. So the wealthy are perceived as much more competent than the poor because of their ability to accumulate more wealth and gain a higher status. In terms of stereotypes about morality and friendliness, this pattern is a bit less clear-cut. Sometimes the poor are perceived as warmer than the wealthy, but sometimes they can be perceived as colder as well. And research suggests that these social class stereotypes are not fixed, but instead depends on the broader social context in which class is situated in. And one such contextual feature that we're interested in looking at is level of income inequality. In particular, we propose that when income inequality is higher, these social class stereotypes will also become stronger, in particular stereotypes about perceived competence. So when income inequality is higher, the wealthy will be perceived as much more competent and assertive, while the poor are perceived as incompetent and unassertive. We're not just interested in how income inequality influences social class stereotypes, but also the mechanisms that underlie this relationship. So in particular, we're interested in how income inequality shapes group dynamics in society that could give rise to richer and more elaborate social class stereotypes. So in particular, we're interested in the effect of income inequality on class-based social categorization. So whether in more highly unequal situations, people will perceive the rich and the poor as meaningful and distinct social groups. We're also interested in the effect of income inequality on the intergroup relations between the social classes. So the level of competition and trust between the wealthy and poor in society. And we predict that these mechanisms would influence different stereotype dimensions. So perceiving the rich and the poor as distinct social groups would impact stereotypes about perceived competence and assertiveness, because those are the stereotypes that already characterizes the rich and the poor. Whereas perceiving a more negative intergroup relation, so increased competition and reduced trust in higher inequality situation, would lead to stereotyping the rich and the poor as less moral and friendly overall. So to understand the first mechanism of how income inequality influence class-based social categorization, we draw on self-categorization theory, which is a well-known theory in social psychology that explains how the broader social context can influence the process of categorization, which then influence the stereotypes that people have of social groups. So in a highly unequal society, like in the picture below, the difference between the wealthy and the poor is very pronounced and noticeable. This situation makes wealth cues salient and therefore make people more likely to use class as a basis for social categorization. So people are more likely to label themselves and others based on how wealthy or poor they are. According to comparative fit principle of self-categorization theory, social categorization depends on the extent to which people perceive greater intra-group similarity and greater intergroup difference. So what this means is that people would start to see all wealthy people as the same and all poor people as the same, but perceiving greater differences between these groups. The theory further predicts that greater comparative fit triggers a search for normative fit, or the stereotypes that people have of groups. So once people have a social category in mind, they then attach meaning or apply stereotypes about what it means to be members of those groups. And here we predict that to the extent that higher income inequality influence class-based social categorization, this should also give rise to a richer and more elaborate stereotypes of the social classes, where the rich are perceived as more competent and assertive, while the poor are perceived as more incompetent and unassertive. In addition to the effect of inequality on categorization, we're also predicting that income inequality would influence the intergroup relations between the social classes that could affect stereotypes about morality and friendliness. So there's a line of research showing that when income inequality is higher, this strains the intergroup relations between the social classes. So in more unequal society, both the wealthy and the poor experience greater fear and status anxiety, although for different reasons. So the rich fear falling down a steep social ladder, while the poor may experience a greater sense of relative deprivation. But this can overall reduce a sense of trust and cooperation that people have in society. Another line of research also shows that when income inequality is higher, people tend to perceive others in society as more competitive and individualistic, which then suggests that this could impact stereotypes of morality and friendliness as well. So when income inequality is higher, we predict that people will perceive both the wealthy and poor as less moral and friendly. So in 2 of my experiments, we aim to test several hypotheses that predicts how higher income inequality would affect different stereotype dimensions and through distinct mechanisms. So first, I hypothesize that when income inequality is higher compared to when it's lower, the rich will be perceived as more competent and assertive, while the poor will be perceived as more incompetent and unassertive. We predict that this relationship will be explained by greater social categorization as indexed by comparative fit. So in the high inequality condition, people will perceive wealthy and poor as distinct social group, and that would explain why stereotypes about assertiveness and competence of the social classes are more enhanced. We also hypothesize that when income inequality is higher compared to when it's lower, both the wealthy and poor will be perceived as less friendly and moral. And we predict that this relationship will be explained by the extent to which the intergroup relations between the rich and poor are perceived as more negative. So more competition and reduced trust between the social classes would give rise to a negative moral and friendly stereotypes of the social classes in the high inequality condition. So we tested these hypotheses in 2 experimental studies where we created a paradigm. Participants were introduced to a world with 6 different countries. Participants were told that these countries differ by their level of income inequality. So participants were shown this graph here where each countries were ranked according to their level of income inequality as indexed by the Gini coefficient. Participants were then randomly assigned to imagine living in the most unequal or the most equal country. So they were either in the unequal or equal condition, and this is a between subject design. So participants in the unequal condition will see this infographic here, and they were told that the top 5% or the richest people in their society earns 150 times more than the bottom 5% or the poorest people in the society. In the equal condition, participants were told that the top 5% only earns 1.5 times more than the bottom 5%. Next, participants were asked to imagine meeting 2 individuals, one from the top and one from the bottom 5% of their society, and were asked to just freely describe what they think these individuals are like in terms of traits, mood, and temperament. We also asked participants to rate these individuals on traits related to competence, assertiveness, morality, and friendliness. So this is our main stereotype content measure. We also measure social categorization as indexed by comparative fit. And we measure perceived quality of the intergroup relations, so whether participants perceive the relationship between the top and bottom 5% of the society as positive, whether they perceive there's trust between the groups, cooperation, and also competition. So now on to the findings. So here, first we look at the difference between conditions in terms of class-based social categorization. And what we found is that participants in the unequal condition score higher on comparative fit, which suggests that they perceive the rich and the poor as distinct social groups compared to participants in the equal condition. Here we look at stereotypes about assertiveness and competence. So first, in terms of stereotypes about assertiveness, what we found is that participants in the unequal condition perceive the rich as more assertive while they perceive the poor as less assertive compared to in the equal condition. In terms of competence, we did not find what we expected. Instead, what we found is that participants in the unequal condition stereotype both the rich and the poor as less competent compared to in the equal condition. In terms of stereotypes about morality and friendliness, we found a consistent pattern here. So in the unequal condition, both participants stereotype both the rich and poor as less moral and less friendly, although this effect seems to be stronger for the wealthy. Here, we're interested in looking at the role of comparative fit in explaining the relationship between higher income inequality and stereotypes about assertiveness and competence. So first, this is a mediation model with assertiveness ratings as the dependent, the outcome variable, and then inequality as predictor, and comparative fit as the mediator. And what we found is that higher comparative fit, or perceiving the rich and poor as distinct social groups in the high inequality condition, could in part explain why the rich and poor were stereotyped in terms of assertiveness. Here, for competence rating, we only found a significant mediation model for ratings of the poor competence. Next, we're interested in the role of intergroup relations, so perceived trust and competition between the social classes in explaining the relationship between inequality and moral and friendly stereotypes. And what we found here is pretty consistent across all of the models. So more negative intergroup relations between the social classes in the high inequality condition could in part explain why the rich and the poor were stereotyped as less moral and less friendly in the high inequality condition. So just to summarize study 1, we found that participants in the unequal condition perceived the wealthy as more assertive, but the poor as less assertive. We did not find the same pattern for perceived competence. We also found that in the unequal condition, people perceive the wealthy and poor as less moral and friendly. And we found evidence to suggest that comparative fit and intergroup relations affect stereotypes on different dimensions. So we know that income inequality influence social class stereotypes, but in study 2, what we're also interested in is looking at the implications of these stereotypes, in particular whether stereotypes of the social classes could influence people's support for different redistributive policies. Like I said, in study 2, we aim to replicate study 1, but also look at whether stereotypes of the poor as incompetent could influence support to provide welfare benefits for the poor, or perceiving the rich as immoral and unfriendly would influence support to further tax the rich. In study 2, we're also interested in looking at how the middle class are stereotyped. So we use the same experimental paradigm, but here we include the middle income group into the picture. We also introduce participants to someone from the middle income group. And we use the same social categorization measure and quality of intergroup relations measure. However, we also add measures for support for redistribution. So the first item measures participant support to tax the wealthy, and the second item measures participant support to provide welfare benefits for the poor. So onto the findings. Here we look at the difference across the conditions in terms of social categorization, and what we found is the same as in study 1, where participants in the unequal condition perceive the wealthy and poor as distinct social groups compared to in the equal condition. In terms of assertiveness ratings, we found a similar pattern to study 1. So what we found here is that in the unequal condition, participants perceive the poor as less assertive compared to in the equal condition. However, we did not find a difference between the conditions for the middle class and the wealthy. For competence ratings, we replicated study 1. So what we found is that participants in the unequal condition perceive both the rich and poor as less competent compared to in the equal condition. We did not find this difference for the middle income group. In terms of stereotypes about morality and friendliness, we also replicated study 1, and what we found here is that for all the social classes, participants in the unequal condition perceive the poor, the middle class, the wealthy as less moral and less friendly compared to participants in the equal condition. So here we're interested in the role of comparative fit in explaining the relationship between inequality and stereotypes of assertiveness and competence. So for assertiveness ratings, we found the same thing as in study 1, where high comparative fit in the high inequality condition could in part explain why the rich and poor were stereotypes in terms of assertiveness. Here, we did not find that comparative fit mediates the relationship between inequality and competence stereotypes. Now we're interested in how intergroup relations may explain the relationship between inequality and moral and warm stereotypes. And we replicated study 1 here, where for all of the models, what it's pretty much saying is that more negative intergroup relations between the wealthy and poor in the high inequality condition in part explain why the rich and poor may be perceived as immoral and unfriendly. So in study 2, we're also interested in how social class stereotypes affect participants' endorsement of different redistributive policies. So what we found here is that in the unequal condition, participants show stronger support to provide welfare benefits for the poor and also to tax the rich. And this makes sense because these policies help to reduce income inequality. But we're also interested in how social class stereotypes influence this relationship. So first, in terms of support for social welfare, what we found is that although higher income inequality may lead to greater support for social welfare, perceiving the poor as incompetent can weaken this relationship. Here, we found that in the high inequality condition, why there's greater support to tax the wealthy could in part be explained by perceiving the rich as less moral and less friendly in the high inequality condition. So just to summarize across the two studies, what we found is that when income inequality is higher, there's stronger assertive stereotypes of the rich and the poor. So the rich are perceived as more assertive and the poor are perceived as more unassertive. We did not find this difference for competence, but this suggests that competence and assertiveness are unique traits, whereas competence is about ambition and hard work, effort to achieve goals. Assertiveness is about ambition, hard work, and effort to achieve goals. Competence is more about natural ability and intelligence. So what we found suggests that inequality may affect assertiveness stereotypes, but not necessarily competence. What we found is that high inequality may lead to overall negative stereotyping of both the rich and poor. So both the rich and poor in the high inequality condition were perceived as less competent, less moral, and less friendly. And our results suggest that social categorization and intergroup relations are potential mechanisms that influence why income inequality affect different stereotype dimensions of the social classes. In study 2, we also found that high inequality influenced greater support to provide welfare policies for the poor. However, negative stereotype of the poor as incompetent could weaken this relationship. And although we found that high inequality, people show greater support to tax the wealthy, this could in part be driven by a more negative stereotype of the rich as immoral and unfriendly. So just to conclude our research, what we show is that potentially in more unequal society, people are more likely to categorize their social world based on class, where they see wealthy and poor groups as distinct and meaningful social groups in society. But also when income inequality is higher, people may perceive a more negative intergroup relations between class, so greater competition and reduced trust. And these processes could give rise to more developed and predominantly negative stereotyping of the rich and the poor. And we show that in study 2 that these stereotypes can also have implications in terms of influencing policy decisions that has the potential to maintain and perpetuate inequality. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and a big thank you to both of my supervisors, Yolanda and Kim.